Okay. Here we do. Okay. And okay, it's the pin spotlight. And start the recording.
Recording in progress.
Okay, so good morning, everybody. And now we will start with first 3 bows to the Buddha. 1, 2, 3. And then we'll do the salutation. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, so we'll be continuing our reading of the Anguttara Nikaya Book of Fours. And I'm not going to be doing every sutta, but moving to the more interesting suttas. But now we'll pick up with sutta number 193, which follows the sutta that I did in the last class. And I'm not going to do the sutta in its entirety because it's very similar to the famous Kalama Sutta, which is in the Book of Threes of the Anguttara Nikaya. I think it's the Threes, sutta number 65. And when we did the Book of Threes, then I explored that sutta in detail. But this sutta, the Bhaddhiya Sutta, has a somewhat different framework than the Kalama Sutta. In the Kalama Sutta, the people who are called the Kalamas come to the Buddha because they've heard, they're not disciples of the Buddha, but they've heard other teachers coming through their town, proclaiming their doctrine, praising their own doctrine to the sky, and knocking down and debunking and rejecting the teachings of the other teachers. And so the Kalamas were very confused, and then they came to the Buddha and said, which one is speaking truth? Which one is speaking falsely? And then the Buddha said, put all of those questions aside. It's right that you have doubts, right that you are confused. And then the Buddha gives them a method for finding the truth by themselves. And we're going to see the Buddha uses that same method here, that same approach, except as I said, the framework is different. The starting point is different. So here, the Buddha is living at Vesali, and the dominant clan in the city of Vesali were the people called the Lichavis. I think that they were probably a kind of Kshatriya, people of the administrative and warrior caste. And so one of them, named Bhaddhiya, comes to the Buddha, and this is what he hears. He's heard that the ascetic Gautama is a magician who knows a certain kind of magic by which he converts the disciples of other teachers. And then he says, is this true or is this false? Because he doesn't want to misrepresent the Buddha. And so the Buddha Now, because seemingly he's being pushed into a corner, he doesn't want to say that, certainly he's not going to say that I'm a magician and that I use a magic to convert the disciples of other teachers to my teaching. But also he doesn't want to try to reject this claim right off, because then it might appear to Bhatia that he's being crafty and defensive. So he's going to teach Bhatia a way by which he can find what's valuable and useful from the Dhamma for himself. And at this point, then he goes into the same kind of instruction that he gives to the Kalamas in the Kalama Sutta. So he says, do not go by oral tradition, by a lineage of famous teachers, by hearsay, by a collection of sacred texts, by logical reasoning, inference, reflection, the acceptance of a view after pondering it, by an impressive teacher, or because you think a particular ascetic is your teacher. But then he gives the essential advice: when you know for yourself, these things are unwholesome, these things are blameworthy, these things are censored by the wise, these things lead to harm and suffering, then you should abandon them. So this is exactly the same instruction given to the Kalamas. And then he uses the same kind of question and answer approach that he uses when he's having this conversation with the Kalamas. So he frames it in terms, first, of the three unwholesome roots: greed, hatred, and delusion. So when those arise, do they lead to benefit or to harm? Of course, he says they lead to harm. And then the Buddha says that when a person is overcome by greed, hate, and delusion, then they will act in ways contrary to the basic principles of ethics: killing, stealing, committing adultery, speaking lies, and encouraging others to do likewise. So all of that is similar to the Kalama Sutta, except here we have one additional factor, which explains why this sutta is included in the Book of Fours. And that factor, it uses the Pali word. It's a rather unusual word, not very common. The word is saramba. Yeah, so this is the word that I've translated here as violence. Okay. And it's not a very common word, so let's see what the commentary has to say about it. Okay, so the commentary says, actually the commentary explanation, not very clear to me. It has the characteristic as uttarya, karana uttarya. Karana is doing, uttarya. I have to say the comment is not so clear to me, but I must have had some basis for translating it as violence. But anyway, so the Buddha is questioning Bhatia and getting him to see that whether it's greed, hatred, delusion, or violence, those states arising internally, even that alone will lead to harm rather than to benefit. And then a person who's overcome by greed, hatred, delusion, and violence will act in ethically reproachable ways, reprehensible ways, killing, stealing, adultery, and so forth. And so therefore, one should abandon those states. And then the Buddha I see that I referred to verses at 439 where aramba clearly means violence. Okay, and then the Buddha goes on to question Bhaddiya about non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion, and non-violence. The good qualities, and those he gets him to confirm lead to welfare and happiness. Then the last part now, this is where we have a departure from the Kalama Sutta. So now the Buddha tells Bhaddiya that the good persons in the world, these are the wise people in the world, encourage their disciples to remove greed. And then when you remove greed, you will not do any actions born of greed through body, speech, or mind. You should continually remove hatred, remove delusion, remove violence. When you remove violence, you will not do any action born of violence, whether by speech, by body, speech, or mind. And then Bhaddiya then expresses his approval of the Buddha, and he declares that he goes for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and declares himself a lay follower who has gone for refuge for life. And so now the Buddha continues the questioning. This is in the new way. So he says, did I say to you, come Bhaddiya, be my disciple, and I will be your teacher? And Bhaddiya says, surely not. And then so you could see that the Buddha here has converted Bhaddiya, led him to his teaching, not through any kind of magical tricks, not through performing feats of psychic power, performing so-called miracles, but simply by questioning him, sort of to draw out what we might call the basic, underlying, fundamental ethical convictions that Bhaddiya already had assumed, and getting Bhaddiya to recognize those ethical convictions and see that these are the principles that the Buddha himself is proclaiming in his teaching. And what's interesting here is that the Buddha, this is like in the Kalama Sutta, the Buddha has not taught anything, any of the doctrines that are distinctive and unique to the Buddha, to the Buddha's teaching. He hasn't taught the Four Noble Truths. He didn't teach dependent origination. He didn't teach the three characteristics: impermanence, suffering, non-self. But he's kept the teaching at a very clear, direct, practical, and visible level, framing the teaching by way of questions, not even making positive statements, but simply asking questions to draw out the understanding from Bhaddiya himself. And the kind of understanding that he's drawing out is what I call this pragmatic, directly visible, ethical understanding. And so what the Buddha is saying is that a wise teacher will teach his disciples to remove greed, hatred, delusion, and violence. And yet, though the Buddha didn't declare anything distinctive of his own teaching, anything unique to his own teaching, but in a way, he sort of indirectly been leading Bhaddiya to the goal of his teaching. Because the goal of the Buddha's teaching, of course, is Nibbana. And in a number of suttas, Nibbana is said to be the destruction of greed or lust, the destruction of hatred, and the destruction of ignorance or delusion. So even though the injunction, the instruction to remove greed, remove hatred, remove delusion would be acceptable, reasonable, something that can be approved by any person with a very clear moral sense, a clear sense of conscience. But when you carry that principle of removing greed, hatred, and delusion to its ultimate conclusion, what you wind up with is moving in the direction of Nibbana, the final, the ultimate goal of the Buddha Dharma. Okay, so when the Buddha says this, then Bhattiya goes on and says, excellent is that converting magic. Here, the Buddha's converting magic is not using so-called miracles and supernatural feats, but the simple method of using questions, posing questions in order to appeal to the disciples or the potential disciples' inherent moral sense. And so Bhattiya now says that excellent is that converting magic, good is that converting magic. If my relatives and family members were to be converted by this conversion, that would lead to their welfare and happiness. If all the kshatriyas, that's the warriors and princes, were to be converted in this way, if all the Brahmins, the Vaishyas, the Sudras were to be converted in this way, that would lead to their welfare and happiness for a long time. And then the Buddha explains why that is so. Because if all the kshatriyas would be converted by this conversion, they would be sort of moving towards the abandoning of unwholesome qualities, unwholesome states of mind, and developing and acquiring wholesome qualities, wholesome states of mind. And that is what would lead to their welfare and happiness for a long time. So it's the abandoning of unwholesome qualities, whether mental states like greed, hatred, and delusion, or the unwholesome actions like killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, and acquiring the wholesome qualities that would be the good mental qualities of generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom, and nonviolence, and the actions that flow from them. Not killing, not stealing, no sexual misconduct, no lying. And then it goes on and on. So even if the world with this Devas, Mara, and Brahma, this population with all of its living beings would be converted by this conversion towards the abandoning of unwholesome qualities and acquiring wholesome qualities, that would lead to the welfare and happiness of the world for a long time. And then the Buddha says, if even these great sal trees, the sal tree is a kind of tree that grows in South Asia, a large towering tree. Even if these great trees here in North America, we might say these oak trees would be converted, or these redwood trees in California would be converted by this conversion, that would lead to the welfare and happiness even of these great redwood trees for a long time. How much more than for a human being? Okay, I just wanted to deal rather briefly with this sutta because I want to pay more attention to the next sutta, which is rather interesting one, and it also raises some, maybe we could call these scholar questions that would be of interest to scholars of the early Buddhist texts. And this is a sutta now, it's spoken by the Venerable Ananda. So the Venerable Ananda is living among the Kolians near a town called Sabuga. And the Kolians were actually the state a little bit to the south of the Sakyan Republic in ancient India. And the Kolians were the family or the community from which the Buddha's mother came. So even though the Buddha was a Sakyan, because his father was a Sakyan, but on his mother's side, he was a Kolian. So he was born from the marriage of a Sakyan, his father, Prince Suddhodana, and his mother, Mahamaya, who was a Kolian. Okay, then a number of young Kolians come to the Venerable Ananda, and they sit to one side, probably expecting a teaching. And now the Venerable Ananda says to them, and then this is interesting, he says that there are these 4 factors of striving for purity that the Blessed One, that's the Buddha who knows and sees, has rightly expounded for the purification of beings, for the overcoming of sorrow and lamentation, for the passing away of pain and displeasure or dejection, for the achievement of the right method, for the realization of Nibbana. Do those phrases seem familiar to anybody? Have you seen that formula before?
Mahasatipatthana.
Satipatthana.
Yeah, again and again we see this in the Satipatthana Sutta. So it's that same particular formula, but now it's applied to a different set of factors, not to the 4 Satipatthanas, but something called, it's a rather long compound, and it can be resolved in various ways. So we could look at the compound. So we have Parisuddhi, Padaniya, and Anga. So Anga means a factor. In plural, it's Angani. And Padaniya is an adjective based on, it's actually a future passive participle based on the word padana, which means striving. And then parisuddhi means purity or purification. So I translated the compound in accordance with the way the commentary explains it as factors of striving for the purpose of purity or purification. And here we find that it's said that that there are these 4 factors of striving for purity, which the Buddha has rightly expounded. But what's a bit puzzling is that if you do a search using the Tripitaka to search for these 4 factors of purification, of striving for purification, let's do that search. We'll take only the canonical text, not the commentaries, no other texts. I put in a wildcard search. And we get only one, whoops. We get reference to it in only one sutta, this one. So even though Ananda has said that the Buddha has rightly expounded these 4 factors of striving for purity. We don't find them formulated exactly in these words anywhere within the sutta collection, directly ascribed to the Buddha. We find them only here. And first, okay, let's go on and see what the 4 factors of striving for purity are. We have the factor of striving for purity of sila. Yeah, so this is called sila parisuddhi padanayanga. So the factor of striving for purity of virtuous behavior or good behavior. And the factor of striving for, the next one is Chitta parisuddhi padanayanga, the factor of striving for purity of mind. The next one is in Pali, Ditti parisuddhi padanayanga, which we translate the factor of striving for purity of view. And next we have the Vimutti parisuddhi padanayanga, which we translate the factor of striving for purity of liberation. Sounds like a rather odd expression. Okay, and now, okay, let me just continue. Now, though we don't find these 4 factors of striving for purity elsewhere in the canon, or we don't find them elsewhere in the Sutta Pitaka, we do find a sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is sutta number 24. It's called the Rattavinita Sutta, the sutta on the relay of chariots, which lay out a scheme of 7 visuddhis. The word used there is visuddhi. And so in the first case, and first the setting for the sutta. Yeah, the sutta itself is not expounded by the Buddha himself, but the sutta begins when the Buddha is praising a monk by the name of Puna Mantani Putta. And Sariputta is in the audience, and Puna is not there. But Sariputta, when he hears Puna Mantani Putta being praised by the Buddha, Sariputta thinks, I would like to meet this Puna sometime and have some conversation with him. And then on a later occasion, Sariputta runs across the monk Puna, and he knows that this monk is Puna Mantani Putta, but Puna Mantani Putta has never seen Sariputta before, and Sariputta doesn't reveal his identity. He just starts engaging in a conversation with Puna. He says, are you a disciple of the Buddha Gautama Buddha, who comes from the Sakyan clan? And Puna says, yes, I am. And then Sariputta starts questioning him. What is the final goal of the teaching taught by the ascetic named Gautama? And then Puna says, the final goal is final nibbana without clinging. And then Sariputta questions him about different practices, stages of practice. And Puna keeps on saying that the final goal is not purification of virtue, not purification of mind, not purification of you, and so on. But all of those purifications are stages in the process for arriving at the goal of final Nibbana without clinging. So then at the end of the conversation, I think it's Sariputta who's summing up. I don't remember whether this was Sariputta or Puna speaking, but purification of virtue is for the sake of reaching purification of mind. Purification of mind leads to purification of you, purification of you. Now we have some new factors here. So you see, purification of virtue, purification of mind, purification of you. These three we find expressed somewhat differently in the sutta that we're now discussing from the Anguttara Nikaya. But then we have some new items introduced. Purification by overcoming doubt, purification by knowledge and vision of what is the path and what is not the path, purification by knowledge and vision of the practice, and then purification by knowledge and vision. And then purification by knowledge and vision is for the sake of reaching final Nibbana without clinging. So we have here the standard list of 7 purifications, and 3 of them correspond to the 4 factors of striving for purity in the sutta from the Anguttara Nikaya. We have one new factor introduced here, the factor of striving for purity of liberation. So this is a new factor. Okay, then continuing, in the Digha Nikaya, at the very end of the Digha Nikaya, there is a sutta called the Dasuttara Sutta, which is spoken by Sariputta as a way of summarizing the Buddha's teaching in various numerical groups. So he starts off with a set of 1s, then comes to 2s, sets of 3s, sets of 4s, and so on. And then at a later point, he arrives at sets of 9s, groups of 9 items. And here he enumerates 9 factors of striving for purity. In the 4s, we don't find the 4 factors of striving for purity, but rather it's only when we come to the 9s that we find 9 factors of striving for purity. And when we look at them, this is quite interesting. The first 7 correspond to the 7 stages of purity in the Ratta Vinita Sutta. Yeah, here I put in the Pali, because I just copied this out of the Pali text. So we have the factor of striving for purification, of purity of good behavior, then purity of mind, purity of view, but then continuing the purity of overcoming doubt, purity of knowledge and vision of what is the path and not path, purification by knowledge and vision of the practice or the way, and then purification by knowledge and vision. So here we have these as factors for purification of the 7 kinds of purity in the in the Relay of Chariots Sutta. But here, because we have 9 factors, so we have 2 new factors added, which are rather strange. At least one of them a little strange. We have Panya Visuddhi, that is the factor of striving for the purification of purity of wisdom. And I say this is strange because usually throughout the suttas, knowledge and vision, that's jnana dasana, and panya or wisdom are pretty much treated as just synonyms, just different expressions for the same thing. So it's a question, why does the text introduce wisdom as something separate from knowledge and vision? And then as the ninth purification, we have purification of liberation, which corresponds to the fourth kind of striving for purity in the sutta from the Anguttara Nikaya. So when we look at these 9 stages of purity, 9 types of 9 factors of striving for purification, we could see that we have 7 correspond to the Rata Vinita Sutta, to Majjhima Nikaya number 24. 4 of them correspond to our Anguttara Nikaya Sutta, that is Book of Fours, number 194, and then one that's just, that seems a little bit arbitrary, that's been added in a little bit of an arbitrary way, the striving for purity of wisdom. Okay, so these are the 9 kinds of purification. Okay, now let us see how these factors of striving for purification are explained in this sutta spoken by Ananda. Okay, so first we have the factor of striving for purity of sila, of good behavior, virtuous behavior. And so how is that defined? First, we have to define the factor of what is meant by virtuous behavior. So the text uses the sort of stock definition of sila in relation to the monastic. So we can go up to Sutta 181. Okay, so here the monk is virtuous. He follows the code of monastic rules, the patimokkha. He possesses good conduct and a suitable resort, seeing danger in minute faults. Then having undertaken the training rules, he trains in them. So that is the purity of sila, of virtuous conduct. But then to make it a factor of striving for purity, we have some additional factors. So that is called the purity of virtuous behavior. And then the desire, effort, zeal, enthusiasm, indefatigability, mindfulness, and clear comprehension, applied with the intention that I will fulfill my purity of virtuous behavior and so forth in various ways. That is the factor of striving for purity of virtuous behavior. Okay, so the strivings of purity of virtuous behavior is explained by these, let's say, by this stock definition of a monastic person's good behavior. Okay, then what is the factor of striving for purity of mind? So first, what is purity of mind? And then it's defined by the formula, the standard formula for the 4 jhanas: secluded from sensual pleasures and unwholesome states of mind, the monk enters and dwells in the first, second, third, and fourth jhana, and then that effort, desire, and so on, with the intention of purifying one's mind, that is the factor of striving for purity of mind. Okay, then we have the factor of striving for purity of view. And then here we have this purity of view is defined by a standard formula, again, another standard formula that the monk understands as it really is. This is dukkha, suffering. This is the origin of dukkha. This is the cessation of dukkha. This is the way leading to the cessation of dukkha. So that is called purity of view. And then the effort, determination, the desire, zeal, accompanied by mindfulness and clear comprehension with the intention of fulfilling purity of view, that is the factor of striving for purity of view. Okay, then the factor of striving for purity of liberation. So first, what is purity of liberation? So the noble disciple possessing this purity of virtuous behavior, purity of mind, purity of view, then detaches his mind from the things that cause attachment and emancipates his mind through the things that bring emancipation. So the things that cause attachment, those would be the things that are the basis for raga, for lust. And so to detach the mind from those things means, in effect, we could say, the achievement of viraga. That is, the viraga is dispassion or the fading out of attachment. So to gain this purity of liberation, one has to cause the fading out of this raga, this lust or attachment. And then one has to emancipate the mind through the things that bring emancipation. And we could say that the things that bring emancipation, maybe we could say the 7 factors of enlightenment. Let's see if the commentary gives a gloss on this. The commentary just says, through whatever objects the mind is to be emancipated, just in such a way one emancipates it through them. And then the commentary explains the fading out of lust as the attainment of the path, the world transcending path. And then at the moment of the fruit, the mind is said to be detached from lust. And then it says, he thereby reaches right liberation. This is in Pali, it's sama vimutti. And then the commentary explains this right liberation as the fruit of arhatship. Let's get a note on this. So it's explaining he reaches right liberation. So it says through the right cause or method, he reaches through knowledge the liberation which is the fruition of arhatship. So that's the purity of liberation. And then the desire, effort, enthusiasm, and so on to reach that purity of liberation, that is called the factor of striving for purity of liberation. So Ananda concludes that these are the 4 factors of striving for purity that the Blessed One, the Buddha, has rightly expounded for the purification of beings and so on. Okay, so maybe we could look and see if we have any questions. So if you have any questions, then please feel welcome to use the hand device to raise your hand. Okay, so I see V has raised your hand.
Yes, good morning, Bhante.
Good morning.
In regards to this sutta, is this corresponds with normally what the Mahayana would say about Sila, which is Jie, and mind, to stabilize the mind thing, and view.
Your voice is a bit low. Maybe can you move closer to the...
Yes. In regards to this sutta,
Yeah.
Normally, I think that it corresponds with what the Mahayana would say, that is Sila as Jie, and mind as thing, and view as Hui. And finally, you go for the Su Jing Nie Pan. Is that how the Mahayana reconstruct their suttas based, or the concept based on this, rather than the Eightfold Path?
Wait. The last one is what?
Is
in Chinese?
Su Jing Nie Pan.
Su Jing.
Su Jing Nie Pan, you go into Nibbana.
Su Jing, what is Su Jing?
Su Jing is very, you go into Samadhi, but very still, and that you get into Nibbana.
Oh.
Is it how the Mahayana would have?
No, I don't think we would say that that sequence is an innovation of the Mahayana. I would say that those terms have been been incorporated into Mahayana from the influence of the early Buddhist teaching. Because especially the Indian Mahayana didn't just sort of pop up out of, in thin air, but it built upon the foundational teachings of early Buddhism. And so in early Buddhism, we always have the sequence, in fact, a very common sequence of Sila, Samadhi, and Panya and Vimutti. Like if we go to the very beginning of the Book of Fours, let's just get to the beginning. Okay, here the Buddha is addressing the monks, and he says that because of not penetrating 4 things, we've wandered for a long time in the samsara. What are the 4 things? It's noble, virtuous behavior, noble concentration, noble wisdom, and noble liberation. So here we have the sequence of Sila,